In that parallel universe, there might be a Professor Clements teaching somewhere. But in that parallel universe, the hippies that run the bookshop recognised talent when they saw it, which obviously in this universe they didn't. My advice is stock up with tin food. Buy yourself a place in the Highlands and get yourself a shotgun, right? Because we're priced for apocalypse. I think the days of people building businesses where they say, we're 200 this year, we're going to be 300 the year after that, 400 the year after that, I think they're gone.
This episode is proudly sponsored by River, the conversational intelligence platform built specifically for recruitment and staffing businesses. Recruitment firms generate huge amounts of valuable information every day through client calls, candidate interviews, vacancy briefings, and business development conversations. The challenge is that most of that information never makes it into systems, processes, or decision-making. River captures, transcribes, and analyzes every conversation automatically, transforming unstructured discussions into actionable intelligence for recruiters, managers, and business leaders. Whether that's improving CRM hygiene, generating candidate and client summaries, identifying commercial opportunities, coaching, or uncovering trends across the business, River helps staffing companies get more from every conversation they have. Unlike generic AI note-taking tools, River is built specifically for the recruitment industry, with workflows, automations, and insights designed around the way recruiters actually work. If you'd like to see how leading staffing businesses are using a conversational intelligence to gain a competitive advantage, visit river.ai and book a demo today. So good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Recruiting Alchemy. Today's guest needs no introduction. Today I'm joined by Russell Clements, former Chief Executive Officer at SThree PLC, one of the world's most successful specialty staffing businesses. Russell joined SThree in 1986, I believe, and helped scale the company into a global recruitment powerhouse, operating across multiple markets and disciplines, but then achieved something that very few CEOs do, and that's when he led the company Flotation on the main exchange of the London stock market in November 2025 at more than £250 million, I read today. Since stepping down from SThree, Russell's remained deeply involved in the industry as an investor, advisor, mentor, coach to many recruitment founders and leaders, including me. I think it's fair to say that very few people have seen quite as much as Russ. It's no slight on your age, but you've seen a lot of cycles. And in this episode, we're really going to talk about what separates good recruitment companies from great ones, the changing shape of the industry and leadership during difficult markets, building high performance cultures, one thing that SThree was obviously incredibly famous for, and the opportunities that Russell sees for the recruitment entrepreneurs of the future. So without further ado, Russell, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Been a pleasure, mate. Thanks for doing it. I know you're a very busy man. So we start every episode has kind of two functions, and we call it, or two mechanics, we call it the two beginnings. Normally it's the origin story of Russell Clements, and everyone's always really interested in where the story began. And then the second bit is generally about the day that somebody decided to step into their own business. But of course, your story is quite different, and so I'd love to really focus on that. And I've got an idea for that in a minute. But I guess just to give our listeners a bit of a flavour, where did it all begin?
Well, I'm from London. I'm from West London. I was actually born in Perivale Hospital, which, for those of you who've got any idea about the geography of West London, as you're coming out of London on the A40, there's a very famous building, the Hoover Building.
Right.
And pretty much on the opposite side of the road to that, there used to be, it's not there anymore, a maternity hospital. So I was born there in 1965.
It's like an Art Deco building.
It's very famous Art Deco
That's
building.
it,
That's correct, yeah. I mean, it ultimately became a Tesco.
Tesco, yeah.
Actually, my grandfather worked in the Hoover factory, and so did my wife's father. So it's got a bit of history for us. But So I was brought up in that sort of kind of part of West London where, you've got a tube station. We had an 01 phone number, but it wasn't exactly London with a capital L kind of thing. It wasn't like Sound of Bow Bells type stuff.
Right.
And I was brought up on a council estate. Dad was a lorry driver. My mum worked for the Walls factory, as in the sausages and bacon and the rest of it. I was like a typical kid from a working class background. I lived on a council estate until 1980. We bought the council house off the council.
Okay.
Thank you to Margaret Thatcher. And we became owner occupiers. Basically, but apart from that, until that point, it was council estate, normal state primary and junior school, and I went to a comprehensive.
And so, like, I know it's not a normal working class upbringing.
Oh no, I think the interesting thing about it, when I eventually got to university, I was amazed at how few people that were there could genuinely say that they were from working class backgrounds. Obviously, it was part of your kind of left-wing credentials as a university student at the time that you had to say that you were working class. But actually, when you really interrogated it, there were actually very few people that genuinely were.
Yeah.
So I always say, if you want to play working class top trumps with me, I'm happy to do it.
I'll take you on.
Unless you're from a pit village or something like that.
Yeah. And so, an unremarkable upbringing in West London.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, I'd say so.
But fond memories?
No, not really.
No. Okay.
Well, no. I was a clever kid in a school where you stood out if you were clever, and not for the right reasons. So when I was a much younger kid, I was quite bullied because I was different, I suppose. The weird thing is I was never a nerd. I was always into music. I like clothes, that sort of thing. So I wasn't your sort of stereotypical kind of nerd.
But it just wasn't cool to be clever, right?
Yeah, it wasn't cool to be clever. Quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
It was a reason to get your head kicked in, basically.
Yeah.
But I was sort of cursed with both that and probably being a bit overly gobby. So I sort of drew attention to myself, I suppose.
Right.
I suppose I was working on the basis that I thought I'd have the last laugh, on the basis that I'm clever and you're stupid, kind of thing. That all changed when I got to senior school, because I kind of basically made a very conscious decision to reinvent myself. So by 14 onwards, I was pretty much, in the sort of like the cool kids clique or whatever.
Got it.
But,
Got it.
Yeah, I wasn't the happiest of young kids.
Yeah, and then off to university. You went to the University of Essex.
That's right.
You did politics.
I did. Yeah. Yeah.
Why?
So I was the first person in my entire extended family even to do A levels.
Right. You said you were a clever kid. Is that something you share with siblings? Is it hereditary, genetic? Was it just random?
God, there's a big question. I've always thought, even when it was deeply unfashionable to think it, that a hell of a lot of let's call it intelligence in the broadest sort of sense comes sort of pre-boxed. You're kind of hardwired.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. It's difficult because if you're from that kind of generations of working class background, you could have a clever relative that would never have had the opportunity to actually have gone to university, whereas you could be a pretty pedestrian middle class kind of person that ended up going to university over multiple generations.
Yeah.
But no, I'm a little bit old fashioned in the sense that I do think a fair bit of it is hardwired.
Got it. You were a kind of like, were you politically active pre-university?
Yeah, I was precociously interested in politics.
Okay, so were you a card-carrying member of a particular party at this point?
Well, I was, and the only party I've ever actually had a membership for was the Labour Party.
Right.
But I was very left wing as a young person.
Right. Okay.
So I would say I identified as being a Marxist until I was probably 21.
Right. Okay.
Which is a bit ironic, bearing in mind. I'm absolutely not quite the top-hatted cigar chomping capitalist, but I'm a damn sight closer to that than I ever thought I would be.
Yeah. Okay. And so off to Essex to do political or politics or political science?
Well, actually, for some reason, the degree at Essex is called government, but it's effectively, it's a politics degree.
Yeah. And then at this moment in time, what does the future look like for a 22-year-old Marxist Russell Clements?
Well, I mean, actually, by the time I got to university, I was kind of groomed, I suppose, not in a negative way, by one or two of the lecturers that convinced me that I could get a first class degree, and I did that when it was a relatively unusual thing to achieve, and the idea behind that was to eventually for me to do a PhD, and I wanted to be a lecturer. I wanted to teach at university level. So if you said to me at 20, do you have a clear idea about what you wanted to do? I would have absolutely said yes. I've got a very clear idea of what I want to do. I want to do a PhD, and then I want to teach. So that was absolutely what I expected to do. And then I had a bit of a kind of sliding doors moment, relatively short while later, that changed everything.
I actually did some research. It's one of the most well-respected political universities, the University of Essex in the UK.
Well, it certainly was.
Or it was back then.
I mean, I was at university with John Burkow, for example. So
the former Speaker of the House of Commons.
Yeah. And actually, I think in total of my...
On your course?
Actually, he was a year above me, but he did exactly the same degree as me.
Right.
He subsequently became Chancellor of the University of Essex, and I was invited to dinner as an alumni. I mean, obviously looking to see if I was going to throw a few quid in the direction of the university a while ago. And interestingly, his political drift has been left, and mine's been in the other direction. Actually, ironically, we probably occupy a very similar space politically now, but certainly at the time we were completely opposite ends of the spectrum.
Interesting, right?
I mean, it was a very political university. I mean, at one point during the miners' strike, we had literally hundreds of miners staying on campus. Because they were picketing a couple of the ports that were near Colchester.
Okay.
So it was a very, very
charged environment.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah.
Interesting. And so you've got your harbouring aspirations to be an academic. Any interest in making a career out of politics and it being a local MP?
No, I don't think I ever had that aspiration. No, not at all. I was interested in politics. I think I had a visceral sense of, I suppose right and wrong. I felt, the view that people were sort of institutionally privileged. I mean, from the earliest stages, I had no time at all for the royal family, for example, that kind of thing. None of that came to me from my family, who are typical working class royalists.
Right.
But no, I never actually wanted to be a politician. I wanted to be an academic.
Okay, and then so you have this slide. So you're in your early 20s. You're still living in London. Mm-hmm. An academic and a recruitment consultant are.
Yeah, well, when I say it wasn't a literal sliding doors moment in as much there wasn't a tube train involved. But it's probably as close as you're going to get. So the brief version essentially is that I was working on a building site. I was working for my then stepfather, who was a former bricklayer. And the idea was to take a year off to sort of really do some reading and then go back to do the PhD. And then I got fed up with the building site. And so I ended up being interviewed for a job at a left-wing bookshop in the Charing Cross Road called Collett's.
Right.
And at the same time, in parallel with that, I was interviewing for V&U Publishing in Soho to sell advertising space on a technical publication called Computing. And if I'd been given the opportunity of the two jobs, I would have taken the job with the left-wing bookshop. And in that parallel universe, there might be a Professor Clements teaching somewhere. But in that parallel universe, the hippies that run the bookshop recognised talent when they saw it, which obviously in this universe they didn't. So I didn't get offered the bookshop job. I did get offered the selling advertising space job, and it's through that I eventually ended up talking to two relatively young men who had just set up a recruitment company together.
Got it. And so begins the start of an unbelievable journey. So VNU, you're selling advertising space, I'm assuming. So this is a magazine, which I guess is kind of foreign concept to a young person today, but it's a physical thing. And it was fundamentally the revenue stream for those companies would be the cover price of the magazine or how much we can flog to advertise in the magazine itself.
Well, actually, it was what's called controlled circulation. So, in fact, there was no cover price.
Okay.
But you had to qualify to be on the circulation. So, so you basically had to be in the IT industry.
Got it.
So the advertisers were either display advertisers, so the IBMs of this world, etc.
Yeah.
They were direct recruitment advertisers, so it could again be IBM, but advertising for staff for IBM directly. Yeah. And then there was a whole section which is basically for recruitment agencies. I was put on the recruitment agencies team, and that's where I met Bill and Simon, basically.
Got it. Okay, great. So I'm going to bring a photo up. It's quite a famous photo, and I'd like you to just talk us through it. So.
Yeah, well, that was our first office in Blandford Street.
Which is in Marylebone, is that correct?
Yeah, just off of... In fact, actually, our local pub that we went to every single evening is now part of the Chiltern Fire Station.
Yeah, so very posh part of town.
Yeah, Marylebone is transformed. I mean,
was it not like that back then?
No. We were there because it was cheap.
Right.
Because our landlords were were Film Fair, which were the film company that made the Wombles.
Right.
And our offices were in some old stables, basically, that doubled up as a studio for them.
Yeah.
And... so there was the people in that picture. You can see this is, a few months after I joined, probably.
Yeah.
So you've got Bill and Simon, who were the co-founders.
So for the benefit of the listeners.
Yeah. So you've got the guy at the back standing up.
Yeah.
That's Simon Arbour.
That's Simon Arbour.
Yeah. The guy sitting in front of him, sort of fair-haired-ish.
Yeah.
That's Bill Botterill. The person pretending to be on the phone is me. It was the law in the 80s that you had to be, if you had a photo of an office, at least someone had to be pretending to be on the phone. The person in the on the left near ground is kind of the fifth Beatle, I guess, which is a guy called Dylan Troy. Yeah. And the other guy closest to us is a guy called Tim Lloyd, and in fact, actually, that's not a computer that he's at; it's actually a microfiche. So, to put this into perspective, we were an IT recruitment company that didn't have our own computer system for the first probably 3.5 years that we were in business. So it was all boxes and folders.
In the late 80s, a computer system was probably pretty high tech at that stage.
Well, it was expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about it. And actually, for SME type businesses, it was unusual for them to have any computerization. I mean, really, the only thing that was kind of computerized typically then was word processing, which used to be called office automation.
Yeah.
And even then, we didn't have even that to begin with. We had a part-time secretary that used an electric golf ball typewriter.
Yeah.
Used to photocopy all the CVs.
Yeah.
Write out compliment slips. Handwrite envelopes.
Right.
Lick the envelope. God, yeah. No, one of the great technological innovations was actually getting one of those sponges that they used at the post office. That was a bit of an eye opener. So
and did you love it from day one?
I kind of did. I mean, I'd always been competitive. I'd always been a bit of a contradiction because, I was this sort of left-wing politics student that spent a good chunk of my first year's grant on a very expensive Chevignon leather jacket kind of thing. So I didn't really sort of fit the stereotype in that sort of thing. So I suppose I always had a sneaking, kind of hankering for the finer things in life, But I loved the fact that it was so intense. I mean, it was, and when it kind of put that into perspective, our core opening hours were 9 till 9, Monday to Thursday, 9 to 7 on a Friday. So, we worked incredibly, incredibly hard.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that I was, from a fairly early point, given a whole lot of autonomy. As anyone who's been in recruitment knows, you sort of run your own desk. It's almost like running your own little business.
Yeah.
And I found that really, interesting and exciting, and actually far more of an intellectual challenge than probably I expected it to be.
Right.
So yeah, I think,
it's often given credit for, perhaps.
I think one of our big problems is that on the one hand, we encourage people to join the industry that have got no previous experience. And so we dumbed down the job. Don't worry, you'll be easy. It's easy to get your head around it. But in doing so, you sell the job short, you know. So, you know, if done right, I think it can be a properly intellectually challenging, stretching kind of thing to do, you know. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
You sent me something last week. I think it was notes, musings, reflections on the culture that you built at SThree over that period of time. And something really stood out. And it was, you said, we intuitively understood that everything is downstream of culture. And I thought about my own experience, and it obviously has a famous culture. And I don't know whether that culture exists today at all. Obviously, the world's changed a lot in that time. But my own experience of culture is it's often only after the event you realised how far it's drifted. Reflecting on that early period in the organisation, was there a guardian of slippage? Was there a sort of monitor that said, you know, who was the arbiter of saying, no, we're not having that? And because and the reason I say that is I've got my own regrets about cultures where I've allowed it to drift. And it's only after the event I've learned the lesson. Was that lesson ever learned? Were you able to avoid learning that lesson? And if so, how? Because I think a lot of people could probably identify with that sense of, how the fuck have I allowed this company to become like this?
Yeah, look, I think I'd give Simon Arber due in the sense that, you know, part of the culture was this sort of culture of professionalism and standards, you know, and, you know, the running joke really was Simon's half German, right? Okay. But, you know, you saw the full German, you know, in him when it came to, you know, punctuality, dress code, all of that sort of stuff.
Right.
So that, you know, those sort of, you know, that was an intrinsic part of the culture, you know, those were an inherent part of it. The other part of it was this, you know, desire to actually just work with people that you liked and you respected and felt they respected you. But probably to bring it alive, I think, you know, if you run the movie a little bit forward from that picture, so we're now talking probably, you know, 2 or 3 years down the road from that, we had a situation where we had the 2 top billers in the company just weren't right. They were, as we used to call them, wrong uns.
Yeah.
And between the 2 of them, they contributed to a very significant, you know, bit of the company's income at the time. But when we had the discussion about the fact that we felt we had to get rid of them because they were poisoning the environment, poisoning the culture, there wasn't even a moment where anyone said, yeah, but on the other hand, think about the revenue.
Right.
So that's when I said that, you know, it's an intuitive thing. There was a sort of, you know, a natural kind of, you know, coming together about those sorts of things. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't like on the one hand this and on one hand that. It was yes, of course they've got to go. And we knew that, you know, in the long run, it would be the right commercial decision, not just the right decision to, you know, encourage a more positive and happy kind of working environment. It was in the long run going to be the right thing for the business.
Yeah. Were you ruthless?
Yeah, absolutely.
Were you as an individual, as a group?
Yeah, look, I mean, Bill is an interesting one because, you know, Bill, everyone that knows Bill will tell you he's the nicest guy ever, and he really is.
Yeah.
But Bill was probably the guy that, you know, showed me that, you know, that the idea of being ruthless in the sense of making the right decision and owning those decisions, I think that's the important point, is not inconsistent with being otherwise a nice guy, you know,
or a good person,
you know. So you know, Bill, in that sense, if someone needed to be let go, you know, Bill would typically be the person that had that conversation,
right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a sense of, you know, we say no mascots, no pets.
Yeah,
you know, that's a little bit of a disparaging way of looking at it. But,
yeah,
you know, in the same way that if you were an outstandingly good performer, you didn't get away with not being consistent with the culture.
Yeah,
you couldn't be this absolute, you know, cultural advocate and a wonderful human being and not actually perform at the level that we expected. So that was the two elements of that, was that, you know, we didn't tolerate underperformance despite the cultural kind of niceties, if you like, and we didn't tolerate overperformance despite the fact that they weren't right for the business from a cultural perspective.
Yeah. And so the whole point of the show is about, that we talk about recruiting alchemy, and the concept is, why do some companies achieve significant scale and success while others seem to sort of struggle along? And I think it is probably the showcase for what smart management looks like, right? So it had a culture of spawning individual companies. So, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say, so is it fair to say that if I'm a top builder at Computer Futures in the late 80s, early 90s, and I've got ambitions to do it by myself, the company view was, well, we'd rather have you inside the tent rather than lose you, and we'll find a way to either, is it a joint venture that we open together, where maybe is it a new limited company where I'm part of the ownership structure, and probably wasn't called SThree maybe back then, and the founders of SThree. Tell us a bit partly about the ideology, but maybe also partly about the mechanics. What was it that allowed Sunil, Gary, and others to go and start these other brands, Natasha, and what were you trying to achieve by doing that? And the final thing I'll say before I pass back is, when I joined SThree in 2003, it was, I would love to know what percentage share the collection of companies had of the UK IT market, but they were all in direct competition with one another, and it was ferocious. So how did you manage that? Was it deliberate? I assume it was. There's quite a lot of questions in there, but I'd love to hear about that.
Look, I think the first thing to say was that there was an understanding. Bill and Simon both worked for previous recruitment companies, right? Okay. They both left those recruitment companies to set up their own business. So I think there was always an understanding that there was a risk that they were going to potentially, suffer, if you like, the same fate that they'd visited on their previous employers. So that keeping people inside the tent pissing out rather than outside the tent pissing in was certainly part of the motivation. It was about trying to create an environment where people could scratch an entrepreneurial itch without leaving the company to do so. So that was the rationale for it. It manifested itself in different ways over a fairly extended period of time.
Yeah.
So it was quite simplistic to begin with, which was effectively, the creation of, as you say, competitive businesses, and that was partly for lack of imagination, if you're honest, because that meant that we thought of the UK as being our playground, right? Okay, that was our kind of landscape, and if we'd thought about it a bit more kind of internationally earlier, then perhaps rather than set up yet another office in Reading, there would have been earlier businesses, in international businesses and so on. So it iterated. It was a very simple, yes, you are the co-owner of a separate standalone limited company. Then after SThree was created in 1999 to facilitate an investment from a private equity consortium, we had to then be a bit more kind of thoughtful about how that worked from a mechanistic point of view. But the principle of it was to have the individual have a sense of ownership of that business. I got a chunk of the business that I joined, and actually, if I'm honest, what it was worth at the time I got it was laughable, really. And the idea that it would one day be something that I could parlay into significant wealth would have been, ludicrous. Yeah. But the psychological impact that it had was all of a sudden, this is my company, So that was what it was about. It was about, as I said, creating that sense of entrepreneurs. I would argue that if you are an absolute out and out entrepreneur, by definition, you go off and you set your own thing up, right? You start your own thing. But there were enough people that felt that they could get most of what they would want to do to get out of that, and potentially build a bigger business, being part of the SThree structure than external to it.
Yeah. Were you always a believer? Do you remember looking back and thinking, I'll do a few years and then I'll see what my options are? Or do you remember thinking, I'm going to give this everything?
Look, I think it would be naive to think you didn't think at some point, is this something that, I could do for myself? Yeah. Maybe one or two of the senior people, we had those conversations. So, it was probably, in that sense, a very smart preemptive move on the part of Bill and Simon. And it required, something that doesn't come natural to a lot of entrepreneurs, which is, a lot of entrepreneurs are by their very nature, they're control freaks.
Yeah.
So that giving up some of the control. I mean, there are people that would rather have more control over a smaller business than less control over a bigger business. And obviously, to their credit, that was never their mentality.
If I think about your journey in 3 distinct phases, you've got this kind of privately held, aggressive, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but sales-focused organization, growing like thunder by all accounts through the late 80s, the early part of the 90s, spawning multiple brands, spawning a group structure. Phase or chapter 2, you take a big slug of investment from a private equity company in the late 90s. And then obviously chapter 3, which is I think the really exciting bit I would love to talk about, you actually lead the company through a flotation on the London stock market. So for CEOs out there who maybe are 100 heads, 150 heads, probably got a nice life, probably making a few quid if they've reached that point, maybe not in the last few years, but certainly in the past. Why go and chase private equity money? You've got it. What does it unlock? What did it unlock for you guys at the time?
Look, I mean, it was a very straightforward. It was a financial hedge. We didn't need the money. Right. We were incredibly cash generative. We started off as a permanent business.
Right.
So when we eventually, we got seriously involved in contract, probably 6 years or so after we started, and therefore for the first time ever, we had a business which, as you grow it, the working capital goes out the door. Right.
Okay.
But we'd always sat on a lot of cash. So there was no motivation which was about we need this investment in order to open more offices or build grow the contractor book or anything like that. It was for us as the senior people in the business.
Secondary to take it off the table.
So literally took it all off the table.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was, I think at the time, Bill said, the world's a funny old place.
Yeah.
And, so it was about hedging,
And this was before the dot-com boom?
It was literally right around the time of the dot-com boom. And that was quite interesting because we had conversations with these private equity companies. And of course, it was actually Y2K.
Yeah.
And we had this...
Sorry, I meant. It
was Y2K. So that we start conversations and the business is going through the roof.
Because of that. So for our younger listeners, why don't we just articulate what Y2K was about?
Well, okay. So basically it was essentially the fact that, as the millennium came, a hell of a lot of computers would never been programmed to anticipate the fact that there was going to be a year 2000, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And there was, at the time,
pandemonium,
planes
right?
were going to fly out the sky. Kind of, the whole thing. It turned out to be a bit of a kind of, damp squib, right? But companies, governments spent a fortune, preemptively trying to make sure that they were still in business on January the 1st, 2000. And of course, it was a bonanza for IT recruitment businesses. However, every serious player that was involved in trying to solve their Y2K problem had done it by the end of the first half of 99,
right,
and shut up shop on everything for the next 6 months. So when we got into the extended latter stages of the negotiation with the PE guys, the performance of the business was going like that, right? And we managed to convince them that this was a temporary aberration,
right?
And that once the Y2K was out of the way, we'd be back on the horse, kind of thing. And actually, what we didn't anticipate was that not only would we be back on the horse, but of course the horse would be put on steroids by the dot-com boom. So that was the immediate aftermath, really. I think we took the private equity investment in the November of 99,
right?
And then pretty much from 2000 onwards, you had the dot-com boom,
which really heralded the beginning of a pretty decent economic period, right? Under the Labour government, up really through until there was some bumps in the road on the way, but up and through until the crash of 2008. It was a relatively stable period.
Well, not actually, interestingly enough, not so much for IT, because what you had was this, obviously this party, and then you had the hangover afterwards. So you had after the dot-com boom, you had the dot-com crash.
Right.
So that coincided with, we'd effectively taken the Barclays, Barclays and Gresham and 3i's money from their point of view with a view to floating the business, within a few years.
Yeah.
And that just became an impossible aspiration because of the consequences of the dot-com crash. And then 9/11, pretty much killed the market for IPOs and all of that sort of stuff. So in fact, actually, the IT industry, having in all previous downturns been last in and first out, in that downturn was first in and last out.
Right.
So there was a period where it was really pretty tough, and that delayed the IPO.
Right.
For a few years. So we had a private equity involvement for longer than both we and the private equity companies anticipated that we would.
And were they constructive partners throughout that process?
I think the key thing is, it was at the time that we were involved in getting them on board, it was a seller's market, right?
Right.
So we were not a distressed asset. They had leverage and guarantees and so on, but really the terms were very favourable to us.
Right.
And so they were kind of stuck with us, really. I mean, what could they do, right?
Yeah.
But that said, what they were by and large were incredibly positive in terms of allowing the company to grow up. Right. So when we did eventually come to the IPO process, what the banks were saying to us is, what you've already got a Remco, you've already got a corporate structure, a governance structure that is more similar to a publicly quoted company than it is for a private company.
Yeah.
So that period of time was very valuable in terms of getting us ready for the subsequent IPO.
Yeah, and who was the stimulant of who was the driving force behind that? Was it you as the, I guess, CEO in waiting at this point? Had you had conversations with? So Bill was the CEO.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Simon was.
Yeah, so Simon was less involved. Simon stood down and became a non-exec sooner than Bill did.
Right.
Bill stayed as CEO until 2004.
Right.
And when I took over as CEO, so I'd been deputy CEO prior to that.
Right.
And then Bill became a non-exec at that stage.
And had you agreed that with Bill that there was a timeline?
I think there was an implicit understanding. I think, one day I just looked at him and said, really, mate? I mean,
and I guess he'd made plenty of money. Was it just time for him to take it easy?
We used to share an office. He won't mind me saying this, but, we used to share an office, and he's got an amazing collection of all sorts of different things. He's got almost like a museum in his house. And he used to love collecting coins and banknotes and things like that. And there was a place on near Trafalgar Square, and I'd come about mid-morning, he'd be saying, "Do you fancy having a walk down to Coiney?" He used to call it, and I'd say, "I've actually got work to do." Right. So there was a little bit of a kind of, if as chief executive, you've got time to walk down to Coiney at 11 o'clock in the morning. You've probably, worked yourself into a period of, you've made yourself dispensable, to say the least.
Yeah. Which is maybe the ultimate goal of any successful CEO, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, so I was pushing at an open door. Let's put it that way.
It's been a long journey from 1986 through to the early 2000s for Bill. Was a flotation always part of the plan?
Yes.
And if so, why?
Because we wouldn't have tolerated, it would have been completely inconsistent with the culture of the business for us to be acquired. So, there was always talk about whether or not, a big generalist staffing businesses, the Adecos of the world, etc., would have been interested in acquiring us. They may well have been, but it just wouldn't have ever sat consistent with the culture of the business. So if you think about how does a private equity company realise their return on their stake, what's their exit? It's typically a trade sale in a lot of cases. Well, that wasn't going to happen.
Right.
So the IPO was the most logical route by which we could then effectively pay them back, so to speak. But also remember, hell of a lot of the management had stakes in the business.
Yeah.
So all of the management had a vested interest in a wealth creation event. So that was why the IPO was the logical thing for us to do.
And it's significantly less common now for a staffing business to float on the main stock market, if at all. So for those that, and I might be in this camp, that don't really understand what an IPO actually is, tell us in layman's terms what that means relative to, we've been acquired by Hayes or Adecco or something like that. What's the difference?
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, the IPO stands for initial public offering, right? Okay, and what that requires you to do, if you do it on the London stock market, is you need to make available for sale a certain minimum percentage of the stock of your business, basically, and it then becomes something that is tradable.
Yeah,
you can buy SThree shares in the Barclays share shop, whatever it might be. But obviously the significant ownership outside of the management. So we retained a relatively, management and ex-management retained a pretty significant, share post the IPO, were institutional investors.
Right.
So the way the IPO works is essentially you go out on what's known as a roadshow over a period of time, and you give these pension funds and the like a reason to think that if they owned your shares, it would be a decent return for their ultimate, stakeholders, which, in the case of pension funds are pensioners, so you go through a kind of extended dog and pony show, if you like, which is pretty exhausting. That's organised, facilitated by some sponsoring banks.
Right.
We had three. You typically end up with one big bank and maybe one or two, kind of smaller boutique kind of businesses. Obviously, I'm talking about an IPO of the sort of scale that we had.
Yeah.
I'm sure, SpaceX might have more than three on the list. And at a certain point, you build a book of interest,
right?
And providing that's reached a critical mass, i.e., you're going to be able to get the IPO away.
Yeah.
You have a meeting where you price it, and you essentially say, well, okay, at this price, we will be able to sell this percentage of our stock, and we'll be able to sell it to, in theory at least, longer term holders of it, right? So what you really want is you want shareholders that are going to be around for the medium term,
right? Rather than speculators looking for a quick
that's
buck.
right. Yeah, exactly that. So in other words, the price point, there's some tension there between getting the absolute price that you float at versus getting a level of interest from high quality investors,
right? So philosophically, it's no different to selling shares in your company to a private individual. You're still, at the end of the day, you're still selling a vision for the future of your business in return for cash.
I think the big difference, obviously, is there's a whole load of rules that wouldn't apply in that case. So if you'd sold, if you'd had a second private equity round, for example, there's a whole load of listing related rules that you have to be. The philosophical position that the stock market takes, and quite rightly, is an institutional investor, a hedge fund or whatever, should be in no better position, and should have no more information, should have no more insight about whether to buy a stock than an individual, who's buying it for their own, their own purposes. So the rules around, disclosure of information,
right?
The rules around, the fact that you have to do formal updates to the market. There are triggers where if certain things happen, you have to then communicate with the market.
Right.
So it's probably the difference between, if a private investment, you're a football team playing behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Right. It's COVID.
Yeah.
Whereas as a public company, you've got a full stadium, basically.
Got it. All the time.
Yes, all the time.
And things like insider trading? Do you get warned on that kind of stuff?
Yeah,
People saying to you, look, Russell, now you're a public company, mate. You got to play. Here's some new rules.
Yeah, well, there are very rigid.
Yeah, and how do you look? Like, how do you make sure you don't fall foul of them by accident?
Well, I mean, you just have to be very careful about it. I mean, you have to be very aware of them. But you know what? I think the other thing about it is that if you've got, and again, I think we were always a good company in the sense of, we did the right thing. Your sense of right and wrong, should be, pretty much in line with most of the obligations that you have as a public company.
Right.
If it sounds a bit dodgy,
it probably is.
It's probably against the rules.
Yeah.
Well, you shouldn't be doing dodgy stuff anyway.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And so do you remember day one of being the CEO of a publicly listed company?
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing is that it's an exhausting process, right? I mean, you are in these very formal meetings back to back. You're not allowed to deviate really from, in theory, what you tell company A must be the same as, company B. I remember at one point we were with one investor and I was going through the book, through the pitch deck. And I looked at this slide and I thought, have I done that already?
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I'm either going to ignore it and I'm going to think that's weird, or I'm going to actually read it again and I'm going to think that's even weirder. And I remember coming out and speaking to the FD and saying, did I repeat myself there? And they said, no, it's okay. So you're punch drunk by the end of it. And of course, then it's exciting to see the shares listed in the Times, all that sort of stuff. So that's you don't become obsessed by it. And
was that a wealth creation event for a significant number of people?
Yeah, it was. It was. I mean, look. I mean, the problem was that the market actually in the short term had actually been deteriorating. So the headline price that we went at was actually significantly lower than we were, expecting. But the idea was, let's get this done, let's get it away, and then there's no obligation for individuals to sell at the strike price of the IPO.
Right.
You can hold on to it until you get to a point where you're happy with the return on your investment.
Because by definition, the shares are now liquid, right? It's where they weren't previously.
That's correct. And and some people did sell in kind of haste.
Right.
And I think within 2.5 years, we floated at £2. And within, I think was it 2007? Yeah, so maybe it was less than 2.5 years. I think we were at 520.
Right.
So
more than double.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you've got this. This is a new company, or it's a new structure. Have you had an influx of primary at this point? Have you got has the business now, by virtue of the IPO, got a load of fresh dry powder that they can spend on growth? Is that part of the plan?
No, I mean, really, the reason why, the rationale, again, we're not a software company that, needs to invest in tech or anything like that. I mean, the reason why, and the rationale that as we explained to the investors, was this is a highly entrepreneurial business with a significant amount of the stock held by the management.
Yeah.
What this gives them is a reason to get out of bed every morning, because they've got something that they can see grow and in value, etc. So it was very much about an ongoing liquid asset that we could use to motivate the staff. It was that much more than it was a kind of a slush fund for the business more generally. I mean, we generated enough of our own cash to do most of what we wanted to do without external funding.
Right. And then I guess, coming towards the peak of your powers, you're the CEO of a listed business doing very well. When did the sort of winds change around the global financial crisis? Do you have any recollections?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, well, I mean, this was the whole point, So we got up to about £5.20 in 2007, and then of course, 2008, 2009, very different world.
Yeah.
And of course, the share price plummeted.
Well, you weren't alone though, right?
Oh no, we weren't. But the interesting thing is, I mean, again, just to give you an anecdote. I mean, I think at one point I was talking to some Scottish investors, and we were at £1.20, And at that point, our dividend, which was kind of bulletproof, was meant that you would get a 10% yield for owning the shares, right? Okay. And this investor said, no, it's a bit too risky for me. And by that stage, I was just, I didn't exactly lose it, but I said, look, if my business isn't worth £1.20 a share, my advice is stock up with tin food, buy yourself a place in the Highlands, and get yourself a shotgun, right? Because we're priced for apocalypse, basically. That said, I can remember going in and seeing, the stock market on the Monday after Lehman's went down on the Friday, and looking at it and thinking, is this the end of it all? When I'd been through previous downturns, it was quite interesting because being based in the West End, you could see it manifested in the fact that the restaurants were less busy, the bars were less busy. The thing that was scary about that downturn was the bars and the restaurants were still absolutely full. So we had this, Nero's Rome or the Führer bunker kind of feel to it. It was like, people were like, so completely, out of, this, if it's the end, I'm going to go down with a drink in my hand.
Well, there's those kind of slightly iconic scenes of people walking out of Lehman's with their belongings in a box. And I was a younger man than I am today, but I remember thinking, what's going on? Like there was a sort of, an apocalyptic feel about what had hitherto been this kind of like relentless, like everybody wanted a job at Barclays, everybody wanted a job at Canary Wharf. It was where the very best people wanted to work because, and I know that because I was in the poorer relation of the commercial division while those in banking were having it away. And I remember thinking, not so fucking clever now, are you? That the world's falling apart. But I guess as the CEO of a very large staffing business, did you have to think long and hard about what you do in response to that? Or were you instinctively, tell me about that.
Well, look, I mean, I remember having a relatively sleepless night. This would have been in 2009. And I walked in, we had a board meeting and I said, this business is too big for the market that it's operating in. We have to reevaluate, And that, as a consequence of that, we made about a third of the staff redundant.
In one go?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, look, what had happened in previous downturns is the business had naturally right-sized.
Right.
But over a period of time.
Yeah.
And the idea really was the fact that, let's get this done and let's back the people that, are still standing, so to speak. And we did it quite scientifically. I mean, essentially, the criteria was if you're washing your own face, then you can stay. If you're costing us money, you got to go. It was quite brutal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that when the market, things are really tough, you get an amazing sense of clarity over what you need to do.
Yeah.
When things are going brilliantly, it's quite a challenge to know what horses to back. I've got loads of opportunity here. What should I be focusing on?
Yeah.
And when you think this could be existential, this could be just about survival, your range of possibilities narrows.
Yeah.
And it gives you this kind of blinding clarity about what needs to be done, which is quite empowering.
Cathartic in a way.
In a way, it's like, well, you know what? We don't really have much choice.
Yeah, of course. And then, I mean, some people say that, and I've made this mistake myself, is that, you go once and you go hard, you go deep and you take the pain in one go. It sounds like you did that in that period. How long did it take the business? Do you think, did it take the business a long time to recover from that particular change?
Yeah, look, I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think it was misjudged in the sense that I had an idea that if we stayed profitable, no matter what, we would get credit for that, right? So, even in the toughest of times, we still made significant amount of money, right?
Yeah.
Nothing like what we had been making. And with hindsight, it wouldn't have mattered, right? I mean, if we'd lost but if we had made another few million less, it would have made no difference to the stock market.
Because at that point you were getting a free pass, or
it was all, it was apocalypse was already, kind of priced in. Right? So, if I had my time again, I probably would have cut less deep.
Right.
I still would have cut it. And I think there's been mistakes made this time round by companies that have gone too far in the other direction,
right,
where they've said, we don't want to cut in, the old cliche about cutting into muscle rather than fat.
Yeah.
And getting that right in the moment is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
But I'd be the first to say, with the benefit of hindsight, when the thing recovered, and it recovered pretty quickly,
yeah,
we would have been in a better position to have benefited from that, had we been less aggressive about the downsize at the time. But you've only got you make the decisions on the basis of the information that's available to you at that point.
And then you essentially retire from full-time work, as it was in 2012, 2011, 2012. You've obviously a financially independent guy at this point. No ambitions to go again and go and run another recruitment or do something different.
I'd done pretty much, in that sense, if you look at it in terms of ticking boxes or buying t-shirts, whatever cliche you want to use, I'd done most of that. I'd also, this was my passion project. It wasn't just a company. It was something that I felt really, passionately about. And I don't think I could have replicated that in a larger organization.
Right.
So, I deliberately decided that from there on, any involvement I was going to have was going to be in smaller businesses. And I think one of the things that I didn't realize until I stepped down from SThree was one part of the job that I'd really enjoyed was that sort of more mentoring kind of stuff, like kind of one-to-one, having an impact on someone's career, which it went away. And, it just wasn't a significant part of my job. And actually for quite a few years. And when I came out of SThree, I was able then to do that sort of stuff with much smaller businesses. And I realized how much of what I'd got out of my job over the extended period I've been around. The most enjoyable parts were those sorts of things.
Got it. Understood. And then in the time since, you've probably got quite an interesting perspective, but you've backed a number of successful organizations, most prominently, I think, Cube 19, which obviously sold to Bullhorn in 2021, I think. But you're actively involved in staffing businesses, in technology companies, including mine. What do you see today? I mean, what does the world look like through your lens? It's changing at pace, obviously. Do you see either in the businesses that you chair or invested in, or in the people that you associate with, what do you think the next chapter looks like?
Well, I think it's interesting that I've gone through, it's 40 years. I mean, we've got a lunch on the 30th of June.
Right, 2026.
To celebrate 40 years since the start of what became SThree. So it's 40 years I've been in the recruitment industry. And in that time, I've seen lots of technological paradigm shifts. I mean, I say only semi-facetiously, the most significant of which was the advent of the fax machine. That was probably the most transformative bit of tech ever. I mean, I'm joking. Obviously, the internet was also a fairly significant one. I think that the difference between this is I'm used to being told that this or that technological innovation was going to be transformative. I go back to the impact of what was called the information superhighway back then. Was we were going to be the roadkill on the information superhighway, right? Well, that didn't prove to be the case. For the first time ever with AI, this is a technological revolution where the technological recruitment businesses are not invited to the party, right? In the main. In fact, actually the opposite. It seems to have had a more negative effect on them than many others. And I genuinely, for the first time, think this could be a completely different paradigm.
Right.
And I think the days of people building businesses where they say, we're 200 this year, we're going to be 300 year after that, 400 year after that, I think they're gone. Right. I think what this will be about is doing more with less, it will all be, and it always was to some extent, but it will be more so than ever about the productivity play.
Yeah.
You know, how productive can individual recruiters be?
Yeah.
And I think technology has a significant role to play in that.
Right.
So I guess that what I expect the recruitment industry to be is probably smaller, more technologically enabled than it ever has been.
Yeah.
And focused on quality rather than quantity, I suppose.
Yeah, of course. And in terms of, as a commentator, I mean, a lot of the people that I speak to have had a really difficult few years. Some of them are seeing signs of recovery, some less so. What do you think in the industry or the companies that you work in and the companies you observe? What makes a good CEO today? Is it about those common threads of, ruthlessness might be one of them, but what would you say? What's the message to people listening who are maybe having a hard time right now? What would you be doing in their shoes?
Well, I think the one thing that hasn't changed is the primacy of culture. Yeah, I still think most stuff is downstream of that, and less significant. So it's about creating and maintaining that positive culture that we've talked about already. That hasn't changed. I think the other thing that we were very good at SThree from an early stage was being very, we were focused on fact-based decisions. We were analysts. We were, we looked at data. We made decisions based on non-intuitive. That's a cliche, but what's intuitive isn't necessarily right, and what's right isn't necessarily intuitive. Yeah. So I think the people that will do well will be the people that are actually focused on the world as it is, not as they want it to be. Yeah. And don't look back at the good old days, because they're not coming back anymore. Right? Yeah. So get real, get analytical, focus on creating the best culture that you can, and gird your loins. It's going to get interesting.
Yeah, amazing. Well, on that note, it's a great way to end. So, Russell Clements, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
I've enjoyed myself.
Thank you, mate. Cheers. Before we wrap up, a quick thank you to the team behind this episode. This episode was proudly produced by Vertical Drop. At Vertical Drop, we help founders, leaders, and businesses turn conversations into content that builds authority, creates opportunities, and drives growth. From podcast strategy and production to social content, guest management and distribution, we handle everything required to help great voices reach the audiences that matter most. If you're thinking about launching a podcast, elevating an existing show, or building a stronger personal or company brand through content, then we'd love to help. Visit vertical-drop.com to learn more. That's vertical-drop.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.